So welcome to everyone. My name is Pradeep Nayak, and we have gathered here for the V2B thematic webinar series here today. So I will speak a little bit about the V2B thematic webinar and the V2B partnership first before I introduce our distinguished speaker today. So the V2B Global Partnership is a transdisciplinary research and knowledge network with over 100 members from Africa, Asia, and Canada, and internationally. The goal of the global partnership is to support small-scale fisheries in the transition from vulnerability to viability. And the way we understand vulnerability goes beyond economic but also includes political, cultural, social, and biophysical aspects of small-scale fisheries. The B2B Global Partnership aims to identify the diverse factors, conditions contributing to the vulnerability of small-scale fisheries and engage collaboratively with small-scale fishing communities around the world and other key NGO, government, and university partners to enhance small-scale fisheries viability. We're conducting transdisciplinary community engaged research in 6 countries of Asia. That includes Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, Thailand, and 6 countries in Africa. That includes Ghana, Malawi, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania. In doing so, the B2B partnership brings people and organizations together across physical, cultural, and disciplinary boundaries through a shared interest in addressing global change impacts on small-scale fisheries. The B2B thematic webinar series, for which we are all together on this platform today, is an initiative of the B2B Global Partnership to facilitate and engage high-level discussions on vulnerability and viability, themes and topics within the context of small-scale fisheries. The goal is to feature academic, policy practitioners, and members of the civil society who have made significant contributions to the theoretical, practical, and policy aspects of small-scale fisheries, both locally and globally. The B2B thematic speakers series takes place on the last Friday of every month, and it will take place throughout 2021. The series is available internationally through live streaming on YouTube, details regarding which can be found at www.v2bglobalpartnership.org. Today's talk is the 6th in the series of thematic webinars that has been planned for 2021, and it is my privilege to introduce Dr. María José Barragán as our distinguished speaker. Dr. Barragán is Science Director of the Charles Darwin Foundation, Puerto Ayora, on the island of Galapagos, Ecuador. Recently, she also served as the interim executive director of the foundation. María José obtained her PhD in human geography from the Memorial University of Newfoundland in Canada, a Master's of Science degree from the Technical University in Munich, Germany, and before that, a Bachelor of Biological Sciences from the Catholic University of Ecuador. Her early research work focused on the marine coastal ecosystems, emphasizing human interactions with wild marine fauna within the context of protected areas, MPAs. Her doctoral research was inspired by the governance of marine resources, focused on marine protected areas and the governance within the Galapagos Marine Reserve itself. As a postdoctoral researcher following that at the Lebanese Center for Tropical Marine Research in Bremen, Germany, she worked on the governance of artisanal fisheries within a focus on sociology of knowledge and development and food security from maritime perspective. An excellent and renowned scholar, researcher, and practitioner, María José has made tremendous contributions to the governance of small-scale fisheries as well as coastal marine systems. Her contributions include numerous publications, articles, research, policy reports, and books. That includes her recent book titled Small-Scale Fisheries Guidelines, Global Implementation, published by Springer, which she co-authored with others. María José is also a co-investigator and member of B2B Global Partnership. It is my honor today to invite María José Barragán to deliver a talk to the B2B thematic webinar series. And today her talk's title is Governance Reflections about the Paradise, Crisis and Opportunities in the Galapagos Islands. Thank you very much, María José, for making the time to talk to us today. And over to you for the talk.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Prateep, for the nice and warm introduction. It's my pleasure to be here, and thanks to the V2V partnership for the invitation onto the series presentation. So as you have mentioned, I will start now the presentation that is, the title is Governance Reflection about the Paradise, Crisis and Opportunities in the Galapagos Islands. Greetings from this place. So the outline of my presentation will include some background information and baseline information on the area and the topic, some past and present context of what the title and the topic is, about crisis and opportunities in these islands, implications on small-scale fisheries as the core theme of my presentation, and some final thoughts at the end. So in order for me to start the presentation, I would love to bring you back to the idea that everyone or most of us have when we think about Galapagos. And thinking on the V2B framework, but also linking that idea to the concept of what the paradise looks like in our mindset. Tourism is pretty much the closest area to the notion of paradise that we may have. In fact, the tourism sector and the tourism and ecotourism industries in the last decades have taken that as the departure point for their activity to be developed and to be fostered in these islands. The notion and the immediate association we do between Galapagos and also the idea of the theory of natural selection by theory of evolution by natural selection made by Charles Darwin almost 200 years ago also is part of this implicit idea of mindset of the paradise and how, between brackets, the pristine sites in the world could look like. And departing from this idea, I just want to mention that these images that I brought to illustrate that actually enhance that understanding and that belief that Galapagos pretty much seems and looks like the paradise. However, we also recognize that the contribution of tourism and ecotourism, which started in the late 60s, early 70s, have made an important impact and substantial contribution to the increase of the human population, the development of the economic activities in the islands, but also to the opening, to the geographic opening of the islands to the world. Following with that reflection and an idea, we also need to recognize that Galapagos is also one of the 24 provinces of Ecuador. Now, it's a national province territory. It belongs to Ecuador. It has more than 30,000 inhabitants living in 4 populated islands. And it also fosters a very dynamic society living, working, enjoying this paradise. The pictures I brought to illustrate that shows a little bit of that situation when we portray and contrast with the previous images that I presented and see that there is in fact a coexistence between the notion of the paradise, the empty paradise, and also the notion of a province site, a province area of Ecuador where 30,000 people need to live. At the same time, living in the islands have many more implications when we think about the normal conditions and the conditions I want to refer later on when we bring the idea and the situation where all the world is at now, and is the COVID-19 crisis. Equally as any other place in the world, the coronavirus 19 situation in Galapagos really made an impact early 2020, the entire archipelago was closed once the lockdown in Ecuador was declared in 16th of March 2020. The implications for the entire country, but even more to the Galapagos, which is an economy which depends upon 80% of economic income from the tourism industry, closed, shut down, and gas emptied. The direct implications of that was people, including our own staff members and volunteers, needed to leave the archipelago within 24, 48 hours. Empty spaces, empty spots where normally and generally we have plenty of tourists going back and forth. We had a very apocalyptic scenario of people getting control of the biosecurity measures everywhere. We had empty markets with very few limited food provision, only supplied by local producers. We had very few communication between islands, and the logistics bringing goods from the mainland was substantially shuttered. And of course, the dynamic within the life and the normal city dynamics was totally collapsed. Businesses, institutions, and services were shut down. So in terms of the implications of the coronavirus pandemic in the Galapagos Islands, we need to add the additional element and complexity element to an island being, again, isolated. So for Galapagos Islands, the shutdown and the crisis of coronavirus has represented a crisis in a double sense. But first, and before to continue, I would like to bring you to a more geographical description of what Galapagos are and where the islands are. As mentioned before, Galapagos is one between 24 provinces of Ecuador, located in the western side of South America. This is a volcanic archipelago located 1,000 kilometers away from the mainland Ecuadorian coast. It has 13 major islands, hundreds of rockets and islets, and 4 inhabited cities within the most important human populations. At the same time, the Galapagos corresponds to a special territory treated differently from a special law that applies only to the Galapagos site. It means that the Galapagos Islands are managed, governed, and treated differently as the other provinces of Ecuador, and therefore special policies and special law rules activities that could be conducted and developed in the archipelago. So going a bit further in the idea of what Galapagos is and how Galapagos were in the past, I just want to invite you to go back to the 60s, when the early times in the Galapagos development look like this. These are 2 pictures that illustrates Puerto Ayora, the city where I live too, that corresponds to a very early settlement when Ecuadorian inhabitants came from the mainland to settle these islands in the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s. However, it was until 60s or early 70s when the tourism industry started to develop a very intense activity in the form of cruise ships that currently are one of the most important elements within the tourism industry in the islands. Currently, cities look like the pictures you are seeing in these illustrations, and of course, differ substantially from the very early image of the islands. It has to be pointed out that in the 60s and 70s, the settlers who came to the islands didn't really believe or didn't really thought that the islands would be developed as a very important tourism destination. On the contrary, the early settlers came following a necessity demanded by the Ecuadorian government to conquer and settle the so-called wild. In fact, most of the inhabitants at the time came into the highlands and were agriculture workers and farmers who dedicated mostly to cultivate land, to conquer the agricultural area and settle in zones far away from the coast side, which on the contrary is not the rule nowadays. and most of the waterfront areas in the islands are conquered and used by the tourism sector. And as I mentioned before, Galapagos gives to us a very direct linkage to the idea of science due to the fact that Charles Darwin was present here before developing his theory of evolution based on natural selection. So Galapagos cannot be understood or cannot be thought about without thinking in science. Science has been and still is one very important aspect in the Galapagos history, present, and future. So the Charles Darwin Foundation, the institution I work for, was created in 1959, and the field work station, the research station, was built in 1961. These two pictures illustrate the creation of the station itself, the building of the first infrastructure here, and it became one fundamental moment in history when the scientific part and the scientific endeavor actually took the most important role on Galapagos development besides tourism. Since then, a very natural association between science and tourism was fostered and has been along the decades one very strategic aspect of the Galapagos being featured and being imagined by many around the visitors who come to the islands. In that sense, the scientific endeavor took very early stages in this decade, 60s, 70s, when the idea to develop scientific endeavor in Galapagos were more involved and focused into develop new findings, collecting new species, discovering new organisms for science, cataloging, mapping. The current approach at developing science from our institution has changed, has shifted, and has adapted and is adapting to the urgencies, necessities, and priorities to understand the systems of Galapagos in a more comprehensive way. So from the scientific perspective, we need to go into the historical approach of what the crises and opportunities in Galapagos have been in the past. I don't expect you to read all the details of this timeline, but I just wanted to use it as an illustration of how the past events from the very early colonial times in 1500s have been related to crises and opportunities along the major and most important events in Galapagos history. The red dots and the red text show the crisis, and the green ones show the opportunities driven by those crises. Very important aspects in the history of Galapagos are, of course, the declaration of Galapagos as a national territory, which is linked to the crisis in terms of political crisis after the independence from the Spaniard king. A new very important aspect in Galapagos history is the crisis driven by the Second World War and the declaration of one of the islands in Galapagos as a US Navy strategic base. An important aspect was also the crisis, economic crisis, after a very heavy earthquake in the Ecuadorian mainland that pushes a lot of migration from the agricultural region in the Ecuadorian mainland into the Galapagos, and therefore to conquer the agricultural zone, which gave the opportunity to conquer and expand the agrarian frontier at the time. An important moment in Galapagos history was 1998 with the declaration by the acceptance of the special law of the Galapagos Marine Reserve, which was a crisis driven by the presence and potential impacts of large-scale fishing fleets, foreign and Ecuadorians, in the Galapagos waters, and the consequent opportunity creating the Galapagos Marine Reserve as it is now, and since then a very important focus into the development of tourism sector in the islands. But I now would like to focus onto the decade from 2009 to 2019, when the numbers show the very important and substantial increase in the tourist arrivals into the islands, with a slight the maintenance of the numbers pretty stable in 2018, 2019. However, what happened until 2018 actually was a very breaking point in Galapagos history, when from one day to the other, the number of arrivals to the islands became zero. So between the income and financial incomes that the Galapagos received due to the entrance fee for the national park, that in an average year counted about $1.5 million until March 15th. From March 16th onwards until 1st of July 2020, the entrance fee of the Galapagos National Park Directorate was $0. So as you can see, a very important departure point is in 2020, where I would refer to in my following slides. So the coronavirus crisis, as mentioned before, hit in three main aspects. That is the normal city dynamics, of course, goods and supplies provision, and again, the control and regulations that apply and still are in place to avoid the virus to be spread in the islands. And going to, in order for us to understand the implications, I would like to mention the frameworks that we have in Galapagos, the normative frameworks we have in Galapagos, either mandatory or voluntary, which, like, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals are being used by many institutions locally, even the government, the local government, to guide and to set the path on the future of development of the archipelago. At the national scale, we count on the special law that regulates and dictates how the activities are in the Galapagos Islands, and two local scale instruments, which is the Galapagos National Park and Marine Reserve Management Plan, driven by the Directorate of the Galapagos National Park, and the Government Council for the Special Regime of Galapagos document, which is the vision for the Galapagos 2030, a very brand new document. So these three frameworks, we are illustrating how Galapagos is managed and governed. After the coronavirus 19 crisis was declared in 2020, we have also had these different scales and different levels of effects at different moments in this year. At the global scale, as everyone knows, the world system connectivity was disrupted. The geographical opening of areas and spots were not working anymore in the former way. Tourism industry globally was affected, as many other sectors of the global economy, and the declaration of the pandemic put us in the context of a global population at risk. At national scale, the economic crisis driven by the pandemic also was added to the previous economic crisis due to political instability in the former years in the Ecuadorian state. Public health crisis was started and still is a moment that are affecting the normal citizen life in mainland, but even more in Galapagos Islands. A transport ban going back and forth. Ecuador borders were closed for at least 4 or 5 months. An emergency state was declared around the 24 provinces in the Ecuador, which driven again with an extra level of complexity into the Galapagos context, which again was locked down from March onwards. The isolation of the islands, which seems like a redundant notion, but the islands were isolated from the mainland, from the world, but also between the islands. The 4 inhabited islands in Galapagos tried to cut this connectivity to avoid contagious cases of coronavirus between themselves. And actually the numbers of people getting sick in every island differ substantially, whether they were or not interconnecting with other islands within the archipelago. And therefore the economic crisis was driven by this lockdown, which again was also part of the social injustice that had been felt into the islands in the past year and a half. So this global, national, and local scale from the effects of the coronavirus pandemic in the so-called paradise gets us to the local scale in terms of how these effects have deeply affected the small-scale fishery sector in Galapagos, which is one of the 2 most important sectors in the islands in terms of economic contribution, in terms of social implications within fishing community, which is not as big as in the mainland, and with the cultural and environmental aspects within the islands. So in terms of going to the effects this pandemic has had in the context of the small-scale fisheries sector, we need to see that the lockdown and isolation had implications, deep implications in the livelihoods of the human population in the archipelago. This isolation and lockdown, again, had implications in the lack or limited food security of the islands, causing an important risky situation of food insecurity within the human population. The economic crisis drove ecosystems' health being compromised due to the fact that people not having any other income intended or tried to get resources in a non-authorized way in the national park and protected areas sites. The economic vulnerability of this community also got exhibited in a way of people not having enough to live, which again was linked to the social justice being compromised and getting several and evident situations of social injustice, and a very interesting part, which is the emigration from the Galapagos back into the mainland and even out of Ecuador of inhabitants who migrated to the islands even 20, 30 or longer time ago. So going back to the context of small-scale fisheries and coronavirus-19 in the Galapagos, we always think and look at the guidelines, the voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries, which is into our own research agenda at the Charles Darwin Foundation, a very important instrument to see and to look at the small-scale fisheries sector, especially thinking in this sustainable social and economic development for the future and current generations. But again, emphasizing the vulnerability and marginalization of the fishing population in Galapagos, especially looking at human rights-based approach, which is for the first time in history, one integrative and cohesive and coherent approach at researching fisheries in Galapagos. And how this integrative and overarching coherent approach at looking at fisheries has become, the Charles Darwin Foundation is now integrating an interdisciplinary team that looks at fisheries not only in terms of fishing biology, which was the tendency in the 60s and 70s and 80s, but also looking at fisheries as a more important sector within the entire food systems production within the islands. And therefore, the trend and focus of our research nowadays is looking at fisheries in this comprehensive way. So very basic information on small-scale fisheries in the Galapagos context. The fishing grounds in Galapagos were started to be used as such in the already 60s and 70s, first by international large-scale fishing fleet, and after the declaration of the Galapagos Marine Reserve in 1986 as the first phase or the first format, and later in 1998 as a Galapagos Marine Reserve area, with only use allocated to tourism activities, small-scale fisheries, conservation, and no-take zones. So a number of fishery management instruments like management plans, action, practices, and policies have been put in place along these almost 3 decades of management of the fishery sector. Some of them are argued to be successful, some of them are argued to be unsuccessful. But in terms of fishing community and fishery activities, the community is getting smaller with almost 1,000 fishers registered and having fishing licenses in Galapagos, but less than 500 being actively fishing on a regular basis. All this activity is framed within a zoning system, which involves the Galapagos Marine Reserve for areas that I already mentioned. But there still is a conflict between the zoning system in place in 2000 and the one put in place in 2016, which has been declared but has not been implemented, causing a lot of conflicts between the management authorities and the fishers themselves. Again, the lockdown of coronavirus-19 strengthened these differences and these conflicts. However, it has also driven a couple of examples that I will refer to later on collective spirit and action within the Galapagos and within the fishing sector, and also had enabled the sector to be a revalorized sector within the local community. So very briefly, just to mention where we are at the research that we conduct at fisheries sector at the Charles Darwin Foundation. From the science and technology perspective, we still conduct fisheries ecology, fisheries biology, fisheries stock assessment, climate change and oceanography related topics into our biological component or working package into our project. We also conduct economic research on the small-scale fishery sector by looking at ecosystemic services, ecosystemic accounting frame, value chain approach of the entire value chain of fisheries in Galapagos, with some very important aspects looking at innovation and vision of the sector in a more long-term perspective. Additionally, we are looking at social aspects within the small-scale fisheries, paying attention to local knowledge of fishers, doing gender studies in fisheries after 20 years of no information and no research whatsoever on gender issues on fisheries, as well paying attention to the role of fish in food security and food safety in the Galapagos Islands, which is also a very innovative and first in its class study in Galapagos. And at the same time, we still continue working with young generations of students, some of them fishers' children, fishers themselves in talking and learning and co-producing things, having a very close interaction with the local fishing community, but also continuing our work in fisheries as traditionally has been done. And then I would like to refer and give you some illustrations on initiatives that has been taken locally during this pandemic by small-scale fisheries, but between small-scale fisheries and other sectors within the Galapagos. And a very important to mention is how this pandemic has driven changes and adaptation that were somehow existing before, but were made explicit by the pandemic presence in the Galapagos, which is, for instance, the association between themselves, between the fishers, individual fishers, fishing associations, and fishing cooperatives to organize, for instance, the distribution of fish products, home delivery fish products during the pandemic. So they actually organize themselves and getting trucks from their own cooperatives, and they circulated within the town, announcing and selling fish home by home when the high level of demand where they choose a spot and stand and sell the fish. So they looked for alternatives to sell their product and get also economic incomes during the pandemic. They also share this initiative with the farmers, and they actually got in touch with Association of Farmers, who also got organized at offering products at home and home delivery, and also creating these garden and vegetable gardens at home, which was a very new thing in Galapagos that formerly was absolutely unthinkable in a very wealthy society and much higher living standards than the mainland Ecuador, having vegetables gardens at Galapagos. But also individual-based actions were taken, like for instance, chefs and restaurant owners started to produce seafood meals, and also having home delivery strategies to offer their products. Additionally, this situation, this pandemic, made visible the role fishers and fisheries play within the community, and it was made explicit by institutions like ours when publicly and explicitly thanked all the producers like farmers, fishers, and farm owners at producing our food and the food the local population, human population needed during the pandemic to be fed. Additionally, some results of our current research that is being conducted showed that, for instance, strategies like social media, in this case WhatsApp, played a substantial role in this new adaptation and new ways and strategies for fishers to organize themselves, to sell the products, and to see how the demand and offer could be managed during the pandemic, as well as organizing themselves in usage of, let's say, trucks and pickups to sell the products around the cities. So new initiatives were taken for them to organize and to see how to advance the important crisis in Galapagos that was driven by COVID. A new strategy was also going back to traditional practices like bartering, food for goods. In this case, T-shirts were changed by fish was interchanged by chocolate. Flea markets were very common in the city. Families or neighbors who organized flea markets in the corner, interchanging products by food or interchanging products with other products that they didn't not need anymore. As mentioned before, vegetable gardens in houses were also regular practice in houses where a piece of land was available, but also some donations were present along the pandemic with fishers. This guy is a fisher, actually organized themselves to donate fish products and fresh fish to families, low-income families, which otherwise wouldn't have had access to any source of protein within the pandemic. But to me, one of the most interesting example of how these initiatives and changes took place is the fact that the fishery sector during the pandemic, what actually was considered heroes. On the contrary, on the fact that in 1998, during the declaration of the Galapagos Marine Reserve, fishers were actually thought and perceived to be the villains. So this change in how the fisheries sector and how the fishers were perceived substantially changed during the pandemic when we, all of the community in Galapagos, realized that fishers actually are playing a very important and critical role feeding us. And this is the image that we have been using to highlight the role fisheries and fishers are playing into the food security situation and dimension within the Galapagos, which is something nobody else thought about in the past. Additional initiatives and reactions, self-regulation, of course, institutions, enterprises, businesses that decided to shut down and not sell, but also to propose or suggest any other alternative formats to sell their products. Restrictions, of course, in the mobilization, in the biosecurity measures to avoid contagious. A lot of information from the government side promoting and informing what the current situation is on the Galapagos, number of people getting sick around the archipelago. Practices within our own institution, control of temperature, control of the wearing of masks, permanent wearing of masks, researchers doing research in the field with very limited capacity, going to the field in very specific areas, but also paradigm shifts like this, in this case, statement and quote from the former president of the Consejo de Gobierno, the former president of Galapagos, telling that the economy and the tourism format in Galapagos will have a shift after this pandemic, which is a positive way to look at the future, and also very interesting, the paradigm shift into what the role of people is, but especially what the role of men in the society is, which so far has been a very machista society and still is a very unjust society, claiming that the role of women is being at home, regardless what the woman interest or potential is, and the role of men is getting jobs out of house and not having to do with household related activities. During the pandemic, and sadly, domestic violence increased substantially. There were events, and one fatal success on a woman who was killed by her husband, and this drove the attention of the local society to this machista and gender violence generated situation where men actually were called to be part of this new shift in the paradigm of mindset of the role of women and men in the society. And also some negative consequences of this situation when nationalism feeling between Galapagos permanent residents and the non-permanent residents were put in discussion when the number of jobs and the economy of the islands kick many people out of their jobs, of their business, and therefore they claim to be in the right to ask for temporary residents to be kicked out of their jobs for them to be employed. So as you can see, we have several initiatives, good and not so good, but at the end of the day, where are we? After the pandemic, small-scale fisheries still remains marginalized still remains poor in the context of Galapagos. However, it's substantially wealthier and with better life quality than fishers in the mainland, but they are more present. They are more evident, and they have at least been noticed by the local society. It still is an aging population. The sector is competing with other sectors in terms of customers, in terms of supply and demand of offering products. Without tourists, the fishing sector has been compromising their incomes. Substantial amount of fishers have or are shifting to tourism activities, with interesting cases when fishers who came or became touristic guides came back to the fishing sector during the pandemic because they didn't have any other income. They became heroes during lockdown, but the question is whether this image will remain or will go back to the villain kind of vision of them. Some good strategies like the associations and the common interest-based activities like production of fish from the cooperatives to the community are ongoing, but nobody knows whether it will maintain as such. But again, persisting conflicts within the same organizations, within the same sector, but also between the sector and the authorities and park management institutions. And some final thoughts on that. There is no question that small-scale fisheries have a lot of complexities associated to it, but there's no one question, one answer to address them, neither before nor after coronavirus. There is no recipe to solve this situation unless there will be a very comprehensive approach at looking at fisheries, not only from science, but also from managers, from governance bodies, from local authorities, but also from the mainland government members. The crises and opportunities in Galapagos are and still are and have been always present, and they are reinforcing forces that go back and forth, and feedback loops are always present in this history, creating opportunities from crisis. But again, the crisis for some are also opportunities for others. So the question is, who are you asking whether it's a crisis or an opportunity? And in Galapagos case, in some cases, will be quite challenging to know the answer. The good experiences during the coronavirus 19 are positive. Some of them are positive. Some of them will remain, but nobody knows whether these experiences and strategies will be enhanced or maybe blocked. It's a strengthened sector, as said. They have been made explicit and they have been present during all this time. Hopefully the sector itself will be strengthened within it to make the best of their capacity in the future. As said, fisheries sector, some of them shift to tourism activities, but going back to fisheries sector, and the question remains whether this sector will be enhanced or will remain as such as it is now, or will actually diminish in numbers and the fisher population in the future will be compromised. Unsolved conflicts are there, still unsolved. However, new initiatives are going around asking and claiming for eventual expansion or creation of new protected areas, which is a very hot topic currently in the Galapagos. I just want to take this opportunity to thank all the institutions who made our work possible, thanks to their donations, to which Charles Darwin Foundation rely upon to complete our work. Thank you very much, and happy to answer any question that could be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, María José. That was a wonderful presentation telling the story of the Galapagos Island, all sectors involved, but also looking at, how small-scale fisheries, have made a switch from, being villains to heroes, and that story is really interesting. So in the next several minutes that is available to us, we will be taking questions from our viewers on the YouTube platform. So Seville is copying and pasting all the questions here. I can read it out for everyone. So the first question, María José, is from Aishwarya. The question is, what is the reason behind less active fishers in Galapagos? As you mentioned that 1,000 are registered, but only 400 are active.
Thank you for the question. The regulation of the marine protected area states that any fisher allows to fish in Galapagos needs a license to fish. These are not inheritable licenses. They were given to fishers when the marine reserve was created in 1898. And during this time, fisheries and Galapagos has been perceived as an unfriendly sector to the conservation, and has been perceived as such, no matter whether it has arguments for that. But most of fishers or many fishers looked at the fisheries as a non-friendly sector for conservation, and therefore a sector that it's rather badly perceived in front of, for instance, tourism sector in the one hand side. But of course, the economic attraction from the tourism sector was much more important for them. And some of the fishers and their sons and daughters became tourist naturalistic guides within the national park, and therefore shift activities, however, maintaining their fishing licenses valid and permitted. So they didn't want to lose their license, but they shift activities to tourism and come back to fisheries once in a while when, for instance, very highly profitable fisheries are open, like now sea cucumber. And during the sea cucumber fishing season, many of the fishers who turn to tourism are back into fisheries to get incomes, to get a bit of money, and then afterwards go back to tourism again. So the number of active fishers are lower than the registered one. I cannot hear you, Prateep. You're muted.
Sorry about that. There is another question from Ghazi Nurul Islam. The question is, what is the main income generating activities for the registered fishers?
The main income is fishing itself. So they are able to make a living of fishing activities. They sell their products to, in normal situation, they sell their products to the community. We, myself, buy and purchase fish from them. They provide to restaurants, to hotels, and to cruise ships. So they can have an income from their fishing activities. When they shift to tourism, they have extra income. But in general terms, fishers can have a livelihood purely from fishing activities.
Okay. Next question is from Valeria de la Luz. Valeria is asking, I was wondering if you know how fishers have participated in the tourism sector in the past and how they are currently involved. And I know, Valeria's research is on tourism, and small-scale fisheries in Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, this is a very interesting question, because if we go back to the very early moments in tourism in Galapagos, we actually knew that fishers used to take tourists with them in the very early 60s. So once the fishers came to the Galapagos Islands, some of the fishers came to the Galapagos Islands from the Ecuador mainland, they started to fish and to make a living of fishing, but a very few tourists came and stayed in the cities, because at that time, the most important attraction for tourism industry in the Galapagos were the cruise-based ships tourism. However, some tourists came and stayed in the very small towns, and fishers used to take them with the fishers to have fishing journeys, and they were paid and they prepare fish for tourists. Afterwards, tourism dedicated only to take tourists to the ships. And nowadays, 15 years ago, started a new dimension of tourism activity with experiential fishing, of fishers taking tourists with them into the fishing journey, having the experience of getting a fish, catching a fish, and preparing the fish for the tourists' consumption. However, this caused a lot of complications and complex situations and conflicts within the tourism sector and fisheries, because of course, tourism sector claim that this is a sector that tourism sector should be in charge of and not fishers. So there were a lot of complications on that. But currently, fishers only are involved in tourism when they become either tour operators or tourist guides or agents bringing tourists.
Okay. The next question is from Muniba Isaac. And the question is, MPAs in Galapagos Islands, what are the benefits of the MPA without tourism?
Thank you for the question, Maniba. MPA, the presence of MPA in Galapagos has also demonstrated to be the spillover, having a good spillover effect over the fish population, commercial species fish population within the Galapagos, but also in the mainland Ecuador. Additional, the presence of commercial fish species in Galapagos that are actually fished from large-scale fishing fleet out of Galapagos has also an important contribution as a nursery and an area where small and young generations of fishing, commercial fishing species are being fostered, like yellowfin tuna fish, for instance. So the MPA's contribution beyond the tourism gets also in the maintenance of the food security of Galapagos, since we, as human inhabitants of the islands, actually demand for fish products from the fishers and themselves. I mean, the fishing community themselves are using the fish being fostered and produced within the reserve for their own consumption and for their family benefit as well.
There is a question from Mundus Maris. And the question is, were you able to do any research on the effects of the international armada, mostly from Asia, seasonally appearing around the archipelago?
Yes, this is a situation that has been permanently causing attention in Galapagos. The last July, the national Ecuadorian state took actions on a diplomatic level. They negotiated between our foreign affairs minister and the Chinese affairs ministry on the potential solution and alternative for these ships and these fleets in the surrounding waters of Galapagos to be not there in a constant way. However, nothing has been achieved so far formally. I know there are several initiatives asking and calling for attention on that side, but formally speaking, there hasn't been any decision yet. I don't know to what extent the new government, we just had a new government elected, will continue with that, and maybe they will say something on that regard soon.
Thank you, Maria Jose. The next question is from Milena Scriber. What was the role of the media and social media in turning the fishers' image from villains to heroes, and how can this image be fostered?
The media and social media played a fundamental role, since media like Facebook and WhatsApp were used by everyone, society members, fishers, authorities, to communicate between themselves, between us during the pandemic. But I wouldn't claim that the social media or any media itself played a role calling for attention to that fact, but it was a socially perceived situation. So everyone was saying that even people who are not from fishers' families actually describe and realize how important they are, because fishers were actually donating fish to less wealthy people, to less income households. So fishers were donating, giving for free their fish catch to people in the islands that were normally very less wealthy people and socially deprived people in the islands. They would even fish for free. So of course the image changed, and the society realized that, and even recognized, oh, these guys are not that bad as we thought before. But it's an image that basically was created, I would claim, by itself. How can it be fostered is something time will see, because again, this conflicts between fishers and tourism always is present, because it's a natural dichotomy in Galapagos. And I cannot tell you how can it be fostered, but from our side at CDF, we are really making a lot of efforts to take this villain image from the fishery sector away, because we are, of course, working with them, for them, and on their side to achieve a common goal.
Thanks once again. And next question is from Ana Carolina Diaz. And the question is how the vulnerabilities brought by the pandemic can foster better understanding of the importance of fishing on the island.
The pandemic itself didn't really cause an effect in the fishing activities itself. Actually, they were one of the few sectors which remained pretty much active during the entire pandemic. They organized themselves, of course. Not all of them went out to fish because there were not enough demand for their product, but they took routes, they took journeys and roles, and they organized themselves who fished today, who fished 2 days after. So they had like this internal organization and managed the time for them to go fishing. So the activity itself was impacted by the COVID. However, all the value chain after the not the pre-harvest, not the harvest, but the post-harvest sector was impacted by the demand. No tourism, no restaurants, no hotels, no cruise ships. So they were cut in their potential to sell their products in the tourism sector mostly. But regarding their normal activity, providing fish for local population was pretty much stable.
Okay. There's lots of questions flowing in, so I'm going to read for the benefit of everyone, especially the audience that is on YouTube watching it. Janmeja Mishra, who is asking how sustainable has been the ecotourism sector on the island? How is the revenue earned from tourism being invested in conservation and other initiatives for well-being?
Tourism industry has been developed since early 70s as one of the axis, strategic economic axis in Galapagos. The sustainability of the sector is a matter of to whom you are asking to. The major operation is taking place in cruise-based ships. Less low scale activities is being placed in the port, in the harbors. I mean, hotels and residences and hostels are offering their products. The sustainability of the activity gets in relationship with the number of tourists coming to the islands. And this is something the national park regulation still is struggling with when deciding, previous the pandemic, deciding whether a limit to the number of tourists should be imposed to kind of regulate the number of people coming to the islands. But again, the COVID came and it was collapsed. So now I don't think someone will think about regulating tourism because here it's desperately needed, and the sustainability of that would eventually be compromised when we just want more people coming without thinking how sustainable this is. And the revenue from tourism invested in wildlife conservation, the revenues from tourism sector is a private business. They, of course, operate in their own interest, but some of the activities have been supported from our institution perspective. Charles Darwin Foundation received donations from many donors internationally, mostly internationally. And we had in the past support from some couple of tourism operator companies for us to do our conservation research, not only wildlife, but also in research and development. However, during the pandemic, these companies, of course, couldn't afford to support us anymore due to the crisis, and they stopped. But let's see how it will be in the future.
Okay. Thanks, Maria Jose. Next question is from Frederick Arma. Some individuals and groups straddle two or more sectors. For instance, some fishers may also eke a living in tourism. What are the dynamics of these individuals and groups?
Yes, they still have the fishing license, the valid and it's a legal fishing license, and they can go back to tourism whenever they want when the season is open. And the other time they go to guide tourists and work with the tourism sector. Some of the fishers actually go back to the mainland, to the original hometown during the low season in fishing. And I know fishers who regularly go back to the mainland and stay there with their families and they come back to Galapagos only during fishing season opens. Like for instance, now the sea cucumber fisheries has been opened recently, and I'm sure most of sea cucumbers fishers are back in Galapagos to do that. So they shift activities pretty easy. That therefore they are interested in keeping their fishing license valid during their life.
The next question is again from Ashurya Patnaik. Do you have any idea on how the law has impacted small-scale fishers regarding illegal fishing of sharks by large-scale fishing fleets in Galapagos, as it has the highest concentration of sharks?
Yes, we claimed we have the highest biomass concentration on Earth on sharks. However, Galapagos Marine Reserve doesn't allow large-scale fishing fleets. We only here in Galapagos we only have small-scale fisheries. The large-scale fishing fleets are fishing in the surrounding waters of the marine reserve and in the international waters. The impact of laws is something the national park authorities are always trying to control and do surveillance on the illegal activities. And of course, shark finning is illegal in Galapagos, and there is quite number of legal processes and prosecutions against violators of the law. To what extent they are finished or successful is I don't know, I cannot tell, but there is indeed impacts on fishing or finning, shark finning, because the migration patterns from sharks in Galapagos to the mainland and back and forth, of course, cause that the potential and likeliness for these sharks migrating to the mainland and coming back to Galapagos could be caught by these fleets. So the impact is quite high if we count on the migration routes between islands and the mainland, but not within the Galapagos.
There is another question from Wonders Maris. I think Cornelia is asking this question. The question is, what is the relation between the research station team and the fishers on the one hand and the tourism people on the other? And how well is the MPA respected in practice? I think by local fishers probably.
Yeah, the relationship between us and the fishers is becoming closer. Of course, in the past, it has been ups and downs. During the Marine Protected Area Declaration, as I said, there were a lot of conflicts between the society and fishers and conservation and the national park, together with the national park. Currently, we are trying to get closer to them and understanding and make them aware that we are trying to understand science from different perspectives. We are shifting this perspective of purely scientific fishing stock assessment that was conducted in the 70s to a comprehensive way to understand fisheries as a social ecological system and taking the fishers' role in the fishing dynamics into account, respecting their local knowledge and recognizing the value of their knowledge, and including topics like gender in fisheries, which no one has taken and thought about in the last 20 years. So we are trying to get closer for them to demonstrate that we have a legitimate interest in getting them to understand the fishery sector in a more comprehensive and just way. Between the tourism and us, as said, we used to receive some contributions and support from the tourism sector. Currently, there is no more because the situation in the tourism sector is quite precarious. And between it's tourism people and how well is the MPA respected? The Marine Protected Area in Galapagos is quite well governed by the national park, counting and recognizing the limitations they have in terms of funding, in terms of logistic capacity, and sometimes manpower. So the Marine Reserve is huge, is really big. So they are doing a lot of efforts to control. It's respected as far as the situation is known, and all the fishers know what the reserve is, what is it intended to, what are the areas to fish, where are the non-take zones. So it's a well-known topic here in Galapagos, and therefore it's respected. Beyond the Galapagos Marine Reserve is something I cannot say because it's far beyond our scope.
Yeah. Maybe a related question, Maria Jose, could be, how is your research, on the three aspects that you mentioned, the biological, the social, and the economic aspects, directly contributes or indirectly contributes to the small scale fisheries and other actors on the island?
Yes, the research we are conducting gets, first of all, we have an interdisciplinary team. For the first time in history, the fisheries team at CDF have biologists, fisheries biologists, GIS experts, economists, sociologists, gender-based experts. So this is a very important change in our research agenda. This is one of the flag projects that we have to demonstrate that fisheries should, and all the topics as well, should integrate the interdisciplinary, ideally transdisciplinary, but so far interdisciplinary approach at looking at sectors like fisheries. So we are trying to continue our fishery biology research because, of course, we need to understand the larvae stages. We are identifying larvae stages and seeing where they are, where the nurseries are taking place. So all the fisheries biology part is still important for us. A presence of heavy metals in fishes, for instance. The economic part is looking at ecosystem value to understand the value of the ecosystemic role into the fisheries and the livelihoods of fishers upon this. And of course, the tourism sector and the reliance on the natural capital. We are also looking at the value chain as the framework where to look from at fisheries in Galapagos, not only the fish itself, but also the pre-harvest, the harvest and the post-harvest factor. We're looking at innovation and possibilities for the fishery sector to get capacity and strengthen in business management, business plan. Now we are fostering several innovation on prototypes for them to develop their own ideas and for us to help them to be to feel comfortable developing their own ideas by their own. Once the project is ended, hopefully they will be able to continue that. And the sociology part is also taking the gender perspective into the role women have played in history of Galapagos, have played in the fishery sector, and how these women are actually taking leading roles at directing cooperatives, at being managers of the associations, and making that role explicit.
Yeah. And it was wonderful to see the, exciting work your foundation is doing with the kids, in preparing them as future, scientists and practitioners and fishers, and that's great. We have 2 or 3 more questions and a couple of minutes left. If you're okay, we can continue with those questions, Maria Jose.
Yeah, sure.
Another question from Moiniba again. Really interesting to see the food commons amongst small-scale fisheries during COVID. Was this always the case and never really noticed?
It could be argued that the cultural practice in the Ecuadorian culture is to somehow give food to your friends or to your family members or to your neighbors. But the way they organized this activity, this initiative, was pretty interesting because it was driven by them in face of the necessity of several members of the local community, which were actually faced to hunger. So they really, in a proactive way, took this as their own initiative. I could imagine they took place like fishers giving fish to their neighbors, but now it was a organized, articulated, systematic initiative, which was actually made explicit by the effects of the pandemic, but also as effects of their own way to communicate. But yes, we all notice it in a very explicit way because it was obvious, but I cannot tell you whether it was a regular practice for everyone within the sector or it was just specific cases within them.
Okay, next question is from Pankaj Tiwari. Has the Ecuadorian government any plan, possibly a permanent solution in mind for the fishermen that is viable in the long term, irrespective of events like current pandemic or any natural calamity?
This is a tough question, knowing that the Ecuadorian government is also facing an economic crisis. We just become a new president a month ago. So we are getting into a transition moment with all the implications of the an economy which based its wealth in primary resources like oil. So we still are far to plan with a long-term perspective on solutions for sectors like either fishers or farmers or street workers. I mean, it's not nothing that we can prevent or predict in the short or midterm. I know that the government tries to advance as much as they can in addressing the urgent things, which so far is the coronavirus vaccine, for instance. So everything has been somehow postponed in terms of this urgency. But viable in the long-term perspective is something that I cannot foresee as an immediate action from the local or national government.
We will move on to our last question, Maria Jose. And the question is from Derek Armitage, and he says, thank you for a very interesting presentation. You talked about the initiatives taken by local entities in the context of the crisis and highlighted a lot of self-organization. Are there lessons here for scaling up these initiatives post-crisis? Will people revert back, or are some of these initiatives being institutionalized for longer term impact or transformation? I think that's a great question.
Yes, the question first to answer that is depending how the progress in the post-pandemic time will be and how the society in Galapagos will react to that. The risk is that the tourism will continue to be in the way it was before, and thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people will come every year, as it was in 2018, with 179,000 people coming to the islands. And the economy of the Galapagos becomes, again, very dependent upon tourism. If that happens, everything will go back to what it was before. And all these initiatives and good practices and lessons learned may be forgotten because wealth will come through the way it was before. The other question is whether the tourism will be the same as it was before. If it is not, maybe these practices will remain because this is the only way we have to produce food. And therefore, we are, as an institution and as persons living here, we also are interested in foster that, in support them, into chase fish to these organizations and farmers. The fresh food from the farmers here are not imported from the mainland, which is another problem. So it also depends on us, depends on them, but also depends on how the market will develop after the pandemic in terms of tourism and how they resist to the potential way of getting money from tourism and leaving these practices behind.
Thank you very much, Maria Jose. I see there are a lot more questions that are flowing in, but we are at time. And we will also announce our next month's webinar talk. But before that, really thank you very much. This was a fascinating talk, bringing in stories from the island that you're based on and you work on, and the possibilities of scaling up and learning from Galapagos for the experiences of COVID and other kinds of impacts elsewhere in small-scale fishing societies would be tremendous, I believe. So we'll continue this discussion, but may I request Seville to bring up our poster for the next month's webinar talk. Okay, so next month, the last Friday on 30th July, we have Michaela Haney from York University, who is going to talk about an international lens on the costs and benefits of compelled migration as an adaptation to the environmental degradation. And she would have a specific focus on experiences, from cases in small-scale fisheries. So please join us next month on the same platform. So I would like to end this webinar with, my heartfelt thanks to our speaker today, Dr. María José Barragán, and also all the people, the audience that have joined through the live streaming of YouTube platform and others, for the wonderful questions and really, showing that there are many vibrant questions within the small-scale fisheries that got across, social, economic, political, and biophysical and other aspects. And we can only do better by discussing this further and learning from each other's experiences. So thank you very much. We look forward.
Thank you very much, Pradeep. Good to see you. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, we look forward to seeing all of you.